Sometimes the smallest inheritance is not a gift at all, but a door left open by someone who knew the truth would need a witness. Caleb Turner sat in the back corner of Whitaker and Hale Legal Services with rainwater darkening the shoulders of his worn coat and a German shepherd named Atlas lying close enough for his fur to brush Caleb's boot. The office smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and weather that had followed everyone inside. Outside the tall windows, the streets of Hartwell, Maine, blurred beneath a cold November rain, the kind that made brick buildings shine and made every passing car sound farther away than it was. Caleb had almost not come. Men like him did not receive letters sealed in cream envelopes. They received parking warnings, overdue notices, and the occasional paper cup of coffee from people kind enough not to ask where they had slept. But the letter had carried his name in careful blue ink, Caleb Turner, and beneath it, the words Estate of Eleanor Whitaker. He had read it 3 times in the cab of his pickup while Atlas watched from the passenger seat, amber eyes steady, as if the dog had understood before he did. Across the room, Preston Whitaker sat in a charcoal suit that looked too smooth for the weather. He was Eleanor's nephew, or so the receptionist had whispered when Caleb signed in. Preston never looked directly at Caleb for more than a second. His gaze slid over the frayed cuffs, the mud on the boots, the old field watch with its cracked glass, then settled somewhere above Caleb's shoulder, as though poverty were easier to tolerate when blurred. At the long table, Mr. Hale, the attorney, opened a folder with both hands, moving slowly, respectfully, the way a person handles letters from the dead. Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker made several specific provisions before her passing, he said. His voice was low, trained by years of reading difficult things to people who were not ready to hear them. Caleb kept one hand resting near Atlas's neck. The dog was 6 years old, broad-chested, black and tan with a pale scar of gray along his muzzle that made him look older in certain light. He had been trained once to search ruined buildings, to listen for life beneath timber and stone, to stand still when the world became confusing. Caleb trusted him more than he trusted clocks, maps, or promises. To my nephew Preston, the attorney continued, I leave the contents of the main residence already catalogued by the estate. Preston gave a small nod, not grateful, only satisfied. Then Mr. Hale turned a page, and the room seemed to tighten around the sound. To Caleb Turner, formerly of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, I leave the Carriage house and all personal property contained within, located at the rear of the Whitaker estate, with full access through the East Service Gate. For a moment, Caleb thought he had misheard. The words did not arrange themselves into sense. Carriage house. Rear of the estate. Full access. He looked down at Atlas, but the dog had lifted his head. His ears stood sharply forward. Preston let out a soft laugh, not loud enough to be called rude, but clear enough to wound. The Carriage house, he said, leaning back. A generous burden. Mr. Hale did not smile. Caleb's face stayed still because stillness was one of the few things life had not taken from him. He had learned long ago that when people expected embarrassment, silence could become a shield. Is there money attached to it? He asked. His voice sounded rougher than he meant it to. A maintenance allowance? Taxes? No cash provision, Mr. Hale said gently. Only the structure, its contents, and the access rights stated here. Preston folded his hands. It hasn't been properly used in decades. Roof leaks, I believe. Bad foundation. Raccoons, perhaps? My Anne had a sentimental streak toward useless things. Caleb looked at him then, truly looked, and saw that Preston's smile was too quick, too polished at the edges. It was not amusement alone. It was relief wearing a mask. On the table between them lay a brass key, long and narrow, its handle shaped with a tiny stamped maple leaf worn nearly smooth by time. Mr. Hale slid it toward Caleb. The key made a quiet scraping sound against the wood, and that was when Atlas stood. Not slowly. Not with curiosity. He rose all at once, muscles gathering beneath his coat, eyes fixed on the key as if it had given off a sound no human ear could hold. A low breath moved through his chest, not quite a growl, not fear, not warning. Recognition. The rain tapped harder against the windows. Somewhere in the old office walls, pipes clicked and settled. Caleb reached for the key, and the moment his fingers closed around the cold brass, Atlas turned his head toward the dark window behind Mr. Hale. His body went rigid. Caleb followed his stare and saw only his own reflection, tired eyes, unshaved jaw, a man who had slept too many nights in the front seat of a truck and still tried to sit upright when spoken to. But Atlas kept listening. His ears flicked once, then twice, towards something far beyond the glass, beyond the rain, beyond the traffic sliding along Main Street. Caleb felt the old instinct wake in him, the one that had once read danger in vibrations underfoot and truth in the way a dog refused to lie down. Mr. Hale cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Whitaker left one additional instruction," he said. Caleb did not look away from Atlas. "She wrote that you should visit the Carriage house before making any decision about it." Preston's jaw tightened so briefly that anyone else might have missed it. Caleb did not. Atlas gave one quiet whine, then stepped closer to the table and lowered his nose toward the key in Caleb's palm. The dog's breath warmed the brass. Caleb remembered Eleanor Whitaker as he had last seen her, standing beneath her porch light in a shawl the color of storm clouds, watching him fix a broken step he had not been asked to repair. She had not offered pity. She had offered tea. And when he declined payment, she had placed one thin hand on Atlas's head and said, "That dog knows the way home better than most people do." Now, in the lawyer's office, with a rich man laughing softly and rain washing the town clean outside, Caleb understood only one thing. Eleanor had not left him what remained after everyone else took what mattered. She had left him the one thing Preston wanted dismissed, forgotten, and gone. He closed his fingers around the key, feeling its worn edges press into his skin. "When can I see it?" he asked. Preston's smile vanished like a candle in wind. Atlas stood beside Caleb, still facing the window, still listening to a carriage house neither of them had seen yet, as though somewhere behind the Whitaker mansion, beneath wet leaves and old timber, the past had begun calling his name. By the time Caleb stepped back onto the sidewalk, the rain had thinned to a silver mist, the kind that clung to eyelashes and made the world look older than it was. Hartwell moved around him in careful little sounds, tires hissing through puddles, a shop bell chiming somewhere down the block, gulls crying faintly from the harbor half a mile away. He stood beneath the awning of the law office with the brass key closed in his fist and Atlas pressed against his leg, steady as a promise. For several seconds Caleb did not move. A man could survive years without owning much, but sometimes the sudden weight of one small key could feel heavier than a house. Across the street, Preston Whitaker climbed into a black SUV without looking back. The vehicle pulled away too quickly, its wheels cutting through a puddle and leaving a brief fan of dirty water across the curb. Atlas watched it go, ears forward, then gave a quiet breath through his nose. Caleb knew that sound. It was the sound Atlas made when a trail had begun. He opened his palm and looked at the key again. The maple leaf stamped into the handle had nearly disappeared from years of touch, but in the damp gray light, it seemed to glow. 3 months earlier, he would have walked past the Whitaker name without thinking twice. It belonged to iron gates, long lawns, and people who kept their distance with polite smiles. Caleb belonged to gas station coffee, county roads, day labor boards, and the cracked vinyl seat of a pickup that smelled faintly of pine shavings, motor oil, and dog fur. He had not always lived that way. Once, he had known how to read blueprints, how to set beams straight, how to make a temporary bridge hold under rain and pressure. In the Army Corps of Engineers, his hands had been useful, his silence respected, his decisions trusted. But coming home had taught him that a man could return with all his limbs and still misplace the map back to himself. Jobs came and went. Sleep came in pieces. Rent became impossible. Pride kept him from making certain calls until those calls no longer had numbers attached to them. Through all of it, Atlas stayed. The dog had been given to him after his last contract job fell apart, a retired search dog no one quite knew what to do with. Atlas did not care whether Caleb had an address. He only cared whether Caleb stood up in the morning. That had been enough to keep both of them moving. Caleb walked to the old blue pickup parked near the curb. Its left fender was dented, its heater worked when it felt generous, and a brown wool blanket covered the passenger seat where Atlas rode like a watchman. Before opening the door, Caleb paused, remembering the night he first met Eleanor Whitaker. Rain had been falling then, too, harder than today, slanting across Route 9 outside a closed service station. Her pale green sedan had sat crooked near the pump, hazard lights blinking weakly. Caleb had been passing through with $12 in his pocket, and half a tank of gas he was trying to stretch into tomorrow. He saw her standing beside the hood, small under a dark umbrella, one hand pressed against the fender as if steadying herself against more than weather. He could have kept driving. People did that every day and called it survival. But Atlas had risen in the passenger seat and barked once, sharp and certain. Caleb pulled over. Eleanor had looked at him without fear, though he must have seemed rough in the headlights, a tired man in a field jacket, boots muddy, beard untrimmed, dog beside him. "Electrical," he had said after checking under the hood. "Loose connection, maybe a bad fuse." "You sound sure," she had replied. "I used to build things that were not allowed to fail." She had studied him then, not with pity, but with a kind of careful attention that made Caleb uncomfortable. He fixed the wire with a strip of tape from his glove box and replaced the fuse with one he had saved from a roadside repair weeks earlier. When the engine turned over, Eleanor smiled as though the whole dark road had been given back to her. She offered him money. He refused. She offered him coffee. He almost refused that, too, but Atlas had already walked toward her car and placed his nose near her hand. That was how Caleb ended up following her through the rain to the Whitaker estate, not as a guest, not as a friend, simply as a man making sure an old woman reached her door safely. The mansion had risen beyond the iron gate like something from another century, white columns, black shutters, tall windows reflecting lightning far out over the trees. Yet Eleanor did not enter through the grand front. She led him along a side path to a smaller porch where one step sagged badly under her weight. Caleb noticed it immediately. While she made tea, he found a hammer, a box of nails, and a scrap of treated wood in the mudroom. By the time she returned, the step no longer shifted. She watched him from the doorway, steam curling from the cup in her hands. "You repair what you are not asked to repair," she said. Caleb wiped rain from his brow. "Bad steps do not ask permission to hurt people." Eleanor had laughed softly, but her eyes had gone to Atlas, who stood near the edge of the yard staring toward a dark shape beyond the garden. "That is the Carriage house," she had said. "No one goes there anymore." Atlas did not move. His ears were lifted, his body still as carved wood. Eleanor had grown quiet. "Some places remember who listened," she said. Caleb had not known what to make of that. He drank the tea, thanked her, and left before warmth could become need. Now, sitting in his pickup outside the law office, he understood that Eleanor had remembered him far longer than he had allowed himself to hope anyone would. He slid the key into the cup holder, started the engine, and looked at Atlas. "Well, boy," he said, his voice low against the rain-soft glass. "Looks like we have a place to see." Atlas turned toward the road before Caleb touched the gearshift, eyes fixed west, toward the Whitaker estate, toward the old garden, toward the forgotten building waiting behind the big house. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt that he was not merely driving away from something. He was being called toward it. The road to the Whitaker estate curved west out of Hartwell, and climbed through a stretch of wet pines where the fog hung low enough to brush the hood of Caleb's pickup. The heater pushed out a tired breath of lukewarm air, and the windshield wipers moved with an uneven rhythm, clearing the glass just long enough for the world ahead to appear and vanish again. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, no longer restless, no longer watching every passing car. His gaze stayed fixed on the road as though some invisible line had been drawn through the rain, and only he could see it. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, the brass key resting in his coat pocket against his ribs. Every few minutes he felt its hard shape when the truck shifted over a rut, a small reminder that the morning had not been a mistake. By the time the iron gates came into view, Dusk had begun gathering under the trees. Whitaker House stood beyond them on a rise, pale and severe, with tall windows that reflected the gray sky without warmth. It was the kind of house people slowed down to admire from the road, then quietly felt relieved they did not have to enter. White columns held up the front porch. Black shutters framed each window. The lawn, even in late November, had been cut too cleanly, as if someone still believed order could cover loneliness. Caleb stopped at the gate and leaned out into the damp air to enter the code Mr. Hale had written on the estate packet. The keypad clicked, the old mechanism groaned, and the gates opened inward with a slow iron sigh. Atlas did not look at the mansion. His ears turned toward the left side of the property, where a gravel service road disappeared behind a line of bare maple trees. Caleb followed it. The pickup rolled past trimmed hedges, a dry fountain full of brown leaves, and a stone garden bench darkened by rain. Behind the mansion, the land changed. The neat lawn gave way to overgrown grass. The hedges lost their shape. Vines crawled over an old brick wall, and fallen branches lay where no gardener had cared to move them. Then Caleb saw it. The carriage house sat at the far edge of the property, half hidden behind maple trunks and a tangle of ivy, lower than the mansion, quieter than the mansion, but somehow less empty. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, green with moss along the shingles. The sliding wooden doors were weathered silver, split in places, with rusted iron handles shaped like loops. A round window above the doors had cracked across the center, catching the last light like a tired eye. Caleb turned off the engine. Silence settled fast, thickened by mist and dripping leaves. For a moment he simply sat there. He had imagined disappointment. He had prepared himself for insult, for proof that Preston was right and Eleanor had left him nothing but a liability. Yet looking at the old building, Caleb felt something else, not hope exactly, but recognition. The carriage house looked like a thing that had endured years of being misunderstood. He knew that feeling. Atlas pressed his nose to the window and exhaled, fogging the glass in a pale circle. "All right," Caleb murmured. "Let us meet it." The ground sucked softly at his boots as he stepped out. The air smelled of wet leaves, old wood, and distant salt from the harbor. Atlas jumped down beside him and moved ahead, not pulling, not wandering, but following a certainty that seemed older than training. Caleb crossed to the doors and fitted the brass key into the lock. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the mechanism turned with a deep click that traveled through the wood like the building had cleared its throat. He pulled. The left door resisted, swollen by rain, and Caleb had to brace one shoulder against it. Slowly, with a long scrape across the track, it slid open. Dust breathed out into the damp evening. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the scent of leather, hay long gone to memory, machine oil, and cedar boards. Caleb lifted his flashlight. The beam moved across hanging harnesses, wooden shelves, a row of cloudy glass jars, a cracked workbench, and a carriage covered in a white canvas sheet. The shape beneath the canvas was elegant and ghostly, with tall wheels and a curved roof, like something waiting for a road that no longer existed. Atlas stepped inside first. His nails clicked softly on the plank floor. Caleb followed, every board answering with a low complaint beneath his weight. Rain tapped the roof and scattered notes. Somewhere near the rafters, a drop of water fell into a metal pail with a patient sound. Caleb swept the light toward the ceiling and saw a small brass bell hanging from a beam near the center of the room. It was tarnished dark except along the rim, where years of motion had kept a thin edge bright. "Eleanor," Caleb whispered, though he did not know why. Atlas stopped beneath the bell. The dog lifted his head. Caleb held still. There was no wind inside. The door stood open behind them, but the air did not move. The vines outside hung limp with rain. Still, the little bell trembled once. A single note rang through the carriage house, soft and clear, too delicate to be frightening, too deliberate to ignore. Atlas's ears rose high. Caleb felt the sound pass through him and fade into the boards under his feet. He told himself it was the old beam settling, the shift of temperature, the memory of motion in tired metal. A practical man survived by naming things plainly. But Atlas did not accept that explanation. He walked past the covered carriage, circled it once, then stopped at the rear left wheel. His body became completely still. Caleb watched the dog lower his nose toward the axle, inhale, and give 3 quiet barks. Not alarm. Not fear. The signal. The same signal he had once used when something hidden needed finding. Caleb crossed the room slowly, the flashlight beam shaking only a little in his hand. He crouched beside the wheel and brushed dust from the old wood. At first, he saw only aged cracks, and the dull iron band around the rim. Then the light caught a tiny carving on the inner spoke. 2 letters and a year, nearly swallowed by grime. E.W. 1951. Caleb touched the mark with his thumb. Behind him, the bell gave the faintest whisper of sound, though it did not move again. Atlas leaned closer, breathing warm against Caleb's sleeve. And in that damp, forgotten room behind the mansion, with rain on the roof and the past holding its breath, Caleb understood that Eleanor had not sent him to inspect a building. She had sent him to listen. Caleb stayed crouched beside the rear wheel, his thumb resting on the carved letters until the cold of the old wood seeped through his skin. E.W. 1951. The year meant nothing to him at first, only a number left behind by a hand that had known it mattered. Atlas stood so close that Caleb could hear the dog's breathing, slow and focused, warm against the stillness of the carriage house. Outside, rain moved softly through the maples, tapping leaves, sliding down gutters, whispering along the ivy-covered walls like a secret trying to find a way in. Caleb shifted the flashlight and studied the axle beneath the carriage. The beam caught dust, spider silk, a rusted bolt, then something that did not belong to ordinary craftsmanship. A seam, fine as a pencil line, cut into the underside of the wooden hub. He ran his fingers over it, pressing gently, then harder. Nothing moved. Atlas gave a quiet whine and nudged Caleb's elbow toward the inner rim of the wheel. "You see something I do not, boy?" Caleb murmured. The dog lowered one paw and placed it with surprising care on the floorboard just below the wheel. Caleb looked down. The board beneath Atlas's paw was darker than the others, not from damp, but from years of being touched, stepped on, maybe opened and closed. He moved the dog's paw aside and brushed away a layer of grit. There, hidden in the grain, was a small iron latch no longer than his thumb. It had been painted over, scraped, then covered by age until it nearly became part of the floor. Caleb pulled out his pocket knife, worked the tip under the edge, and lifted. The latch came loose with a faint metallic click. The floorboard rose half an inch. The sound that followed was not dramatic, not loud, but it made the hairs along Caleb's arms rise. Somewhere inside the carriage, a hidden spring released with a tired sigh. The panel beneath the carved axle shifted outward. Atlas stepped back, tail still, eyes bright. Caleb reached under the carriage and eased the narrow panel open. A smell drifted out, dry paper, cedar, old metal, and something faintly sweet, like lavender that had survived by hiding from the air. Inside the hollow space was a tin cylinder wrapped in oilcloth, a small brass key no bigger than a child's finger, and a folded note tied with blue thread. Caleb sat back on his heels. For a long moment, he did not touch them. He had fixed enough old things to know that some objects should be approached with respect. They were not valuable because of what they could buy. They were valuable because someone had trusted time to carry them. He lifted the note first. The paper had yellowed at the edges but held together as he unfolded it under the flashlight. Eleanor's handwriting was thin and careful, the same blue ink from the envelope that had brought him to the law office. Caleb read slowly, lips moving without sound. Do not trust the main house. It remembers only what it was paid to forget. If this has found the right hands, then Atlas will already know where to stand. The carriage kept the first truth. The road kept the rest. Caleb lowered the note and felt the room widen around him, though nothing had moved. Rain tapped above. The bell hung silent. Atlas watched him with that steady animal patience that made human doubt seem almost foolish. The road, Caleb said softly. The words sounded different inside the carriage house, less like a direction and more like an instruction. He looked at the tin cylinder next. The oilcloth resisted at first, stiff with age, then loosened under his fingers. Inside was a roll of old film, black and tightly wound, protected in a metal case stamped with the name Hartwell Photo Supply. Caleb had passed the place earlier that afternoon, a narrow storefront beside a barber shop, its sign faded but still lit. He held the film up, and the flashlight caught the dull curve of it. Pictures. Eleanor had hidden pictures where no one would think to look, inside a carriage no one valued, beneath a wheel marked with her initials. The small key lay last in the compartment, brass like the larger one but newer, its teeth delicate and unusual. Caleb slipped it into his coat pocket with the note and the film. He closed the hidden panel carefully, not because he wished to conceal it from the past, but because the old carriage felt like it deserved not to be left open and exposed. Atlas circled once, then returned to the dark floorboard and sniffed along its edges. Caleb followed the motion with his light. Beneath the dust, near the base of the workbench, he noticed faint parallel scratches in the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged across the same path many times. The marks led from the carriage to the eastern wall, the same direction Atlas had watched from the moment they arrived. Caleb stood, knees stiff, and crossed the room. The eastern wall was lined with shelves full of useless-looking things, cracked lanterns, empty feed tins, folded horse blankets, a wooden crate of rusted horseshoes. Atlas came beside him and sat, perfectly square, facing the wall. Not moving. Not blinking. Caleb lifted one lantern, then another. Behind them, the boards were cleaner in a rectangular shape, as if something had once hung there for years and had only recently been removed. He touched the place. The wall felt colder than it should have. Not tonight, he whispered, though he did not know whether he was speaking to Atlas, Eleanor, or himself. Darkness had settled fully outside, and the carriage house seemed deeper now, filled with corners his flashlight could not soften. Caleb was tired in the way that made old memories loosen. He had learned not to dig too far into mysteries after sunset unless he had to. He spread his bedroll near the open doorway where the air felt fresher, set a battery lantern on the floor, and placed Eleanor's note beside him. Atlas did not lie down. He remained near the eastern wall, guarding it as though something behind those boards had begun breathing. Caleb watched him through the dim amber light. He thought of Eleanor's porch, her careful eyes, the way she had said some places remembered who listened. He had come here believing he might sleep one night under a leaking roof and leave in the morning with a decision. Instead, he had found a message, a film roll, a second key, and a dog who refused to let the past stay buried. Near midnight, as rain faded into mist, the brass bell above the carriage stirred once more. One soft note trembled through the room. Atlas finally turned his head toward Caleb, and in that look was neither fear nor confusion. It was invitation. Caleb closed his hand around the small key in his pocket, and understood that morning would not bring an answer. It would bring the next door. Morning came slowly to the carriage house, pale and gray, sliding through the cracked round window above the doors and turning the dust in the air into drifting silver. Caleb woke before the sun cleared the maples, not because he had slept well, but because Atlas was standing beside him, motionless, staring toward the eastern wall. The battery lantern had faded to a weak glow. His bedroll smelled of damp canvas. Somewhere outside, water fell from the roof in steady drops, counting time against a rusted bucket near the door. Caleb sat up, stiff in the shoulders, and for a few seconds he had to remind himself where he was. Not in the pickup. Not behind a closed grocery store. Not at a rest stop with highway lights burning through the windshield. He was inside a carriage house that legally belonged to him, with a roll of hidden film in his coat pocket, a small brass key beside his ribs, and an old woman's warning folded close to his heart. The thought should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt unfinished. He rubbed both hands over his face, then looked at Atlas. "You have been waiting all night, have you?" The German shepherd gave no bark, only a slow blink, then turned his head toward the carriage as if reminding Caleb where the first clue had come from. Caleb packed his bedroll, checked the door, and slipped Eleanor's note into the inner pocket of his coat. The words had lived in his mind all night. Do not trust the main house. The carriage kept the first truth. The road kept the rest. He did not yet know what road she meant, but he knew where the film might begin to speak. Hartwell Photo Supply opened at 9, according to a small painted sign he had seen through rain the day before. Caleb had just enough cash for coffee, dog food, and maybe the kind of favor a stranger asked with lowered eyes. The drive into town was quiet. Mist lay over the fields in long white bands, and the truck tires hissed along the wet county road. Atlas rode with his head near the window, nose working whenever the wind slipped through a crack in the seal. Hartwell looked softer in the morning, less guarded. A bakery sign glowed pink behind fog glass. A mail carrier in a blue jacket crossed Main Street with a canvas bag over one shoulder. The harbor bells sounded faintly from beyond the rooftops, slow and hollow, as if the town itself were waking from a dream it had not understood. Hartwell Photo Supply sat between a barber shop and a clothes tailor, its narrow window filled with old cameras, yellow envelopes, and framed black and white portraits of weddings, fishing boats, school teams, and soldiers whose names had likely been spoken less often with each passing year. A bell above the door gave a tired jingle when Caleb entered. The shop smelled of dust, chemicals, cardboard, and coffee burned down too long in the pot. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 60s with silver hair cut short and square glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked at Caleb, then at Atlas waiting politely beside his leg. "That dog comes in clean, he can stay," she said. "He is cleaner than my truck," Caleb answered. The woman almost smiled. "Most things are. What can I do for you?" Caleb took out the metal film case and placed it on the counter with the care of a man setting down something fragile enough to change him. "I found this in an old carriage," he said. "I was told this place might know what to do with it." The woman's expression changed before she touched it. Not fear, not surprise, but memory recognizing its own handwriting. She leaned closer and read the faded stamp on the side. "Hartwell Photo Supply," she whispered. "My father used those tins. We have not sold this kind of stock in 40 years. Her name was Ruth Mallory, and she spoke while preparing the darkroom as though ordinary conversation could keep the past from arriving too quickly. Caleb waited near the counter while Atlas lay with his front paws crossed, eyes never leaving the door to the back room. Minutes stretched. The town moved beyond the window. A truck rumbled by. Someone laughed outside the barber shop. But inside, time narrowed to the faint sound of water running in trays and Ruth's careful movements behind the curtain. When she finally returned, she was holding a strip of negatives with both hands. Her face had gone pale. "There are images," she said. "Old but good enough. I can make quick prints." Caleb nodded because his voice had stepped away from him. The first print appeared under the red safe light on a small tray, ghostly at first, then darkening into shape. Eleanor Whitaker, young and straight-backed, stood beside the carriage house in a summer dress, one hand resting on the very will Caleb had opened the night before. Next to her stood a young man in an army uniform, smiling with the shy pride of someone home on leave. Behind them, where Caleb had seen only weeds and wet leaves, a stone road curved away into the trees. Ruth lifted another print. This one showed townspeople lined along that road with crates, blankets, sacks of flour, and medicine boxes stacked near the carriage house doors. A wooden sign stood in the background, clear enough for Caleb to read after Ruth handed him a magnifying glass. Whitaker Relief Land. The words struck him gently, then deeply. Relief land? Not private garden. Not family estate. Land meant to shelter people who had lost something. The third photo showed the same sign after a flood, mud high along the posts, families standing together in work clothes, tired but upright. The fourth showed men removing the sign. Their faces were partly turned away. The fifth was different. Eleanor, older by perhaps 10 years, stood alone at the edge of the stone road, holding a folded paper. On the back of the print, written in the same careful blue ink, were the words, "They buried the road after the flood." Ask why. Ruth read it over Caleb's shoulder and crossed herself without seeming to notice. "My mother used to talk about that flood," she said softly. 1951. Whole families lost homes near the marsh. The Whitakers opened land for them, or that was the story. Then people stopped talking about it. Caleb stared at the photograph until the room blurred around the edges. Atlas rose suddenly and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's knee, grounding him in the present. "Do you know where this road went?" Caleb asked. Ruth looked through the shop window toward the hill where the Whitaker mansion hid beyond town. "Behind the estate, I think. But there is no road there anymore." Caleb slid the prints carefully back into the envelope. In his pocket, the small brass key seemed to warm against his coat. He thought of Preston's polished smile, his quick laughter, the way relief had hidden behind contempt. He thought of Eleanor's warning and the bell that rang without wind. Outside, the morning brightened, but it did not feel lighter. It felt revealed. Caleb paid what he could. Ruth refused half of it, and wrote her phone number on the envelope. "Some pictures are not meant to stay in drawers," she said. Caleb stepped back onto Main Street with Atlas beside him and the photographs held close beneath his coat. The rain had stopped. Far above the rooftops, a strip of blue opened in the clouds. Atlas turned west before Caleb gave any command. Back toward the estate. Back toward the Carriage house. Back toward the road someone had worked very hard to erase. Caleb followed, feeling with each step that Eleanor had not left him a mystery to solve for himself alone. She had left him a memory that belonged to people who never should have been forgotten. By late morning, Caleb's pickup rolled back through the iron gates of the Whitaker estate with the envelope of photographs tucked inside his coat, and Atlas sitting rigid beside him, eyes fixed on the overgrown service road as if the old stones beneath the weeds were already speaking. The rain had ended, but the property still held the storm in every surface. Water clung to the black railings. Drops gathered along the bare maple branches and fell one by one into the grass. The mansion looked freshly washed and colder for it, its tall windows reflecting a broken sky. Caleb drove past it without slowing. He no longer saw grandeur there. He saw a house that had stood too long above a buried story. The Carriage house waited at the edge of the grounds, its silver doors half open from the night before, its small brass bell barely visible in the rafters. Caleb parked near the entrance, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. He had spent years learning to leave before anyone asked him to keep his life light enough that losing a place did not break him. But now the thought of Preston Whitaker stepping inside that old building, touching Eleanor's hidden compartment, or tearing down the eastern wall made something steady and protective rise in him. It was not anger. It was duty. Atlas gave a low breath and looked toward the mansion. Caleb followed his gaze. A black SUV had appeared near the side drive, clean and polished, moving slowly over the gravel like it owned not only the road but the silence around it. Preston stepped out before Caleb could open his truck door. He wore a dark overcoat and leather gloves, his hair neatly combed, his expression arranged into the kind of smile people used when they wanted a conversation to look polite from a distance. In one hand, he carried a slim folder. In the other, a set of keys that were not his to use anymore. "Mr. Turner," Preston called, crossing the wet grass without looking down at his shoes. "I was hoping to spare you some trouble." Caleb stepped from the truck. Atlas came around to his left side and stood quietly, not lunging, not barking, only watching with the full attention that made careless men uncomfortable. "Trouble usually introduces itself that way," Caleb said. Preston's smile tightened. "You have had a night to inspect the structure. I imagine you understand the condition it is in. My aunt was sentimental, but sentiment does not repair roofs. I am prepared to offer you a fair payment today. Cashier's check. No complications." He opened the folder just enough for Caleb to see a contract clipped inside. "You sign, you walk away with money in your pocket, and I handle the taxes, demolition permits, and cleanup." The word demolition settled between them like dust falling from a beam. Atlas's ears lifted. Caleb kept his voice even. That is quick. Practical, Preston corrected. A man in your situation should appreciate practical. There it was, dressed in soft words but plain enough. A man in your situation. Caleb had heard versions of it in shelters, on job sites, outside diners when someone decided kindness had limits. He looked at the carriage house, then back at Preston. My situation is that Eleanor Whitaker left this place to me. Preston exhaled through his nose, a small sound of impatience escaping the polished mask. My aunt was not always clear-minded near the end. Atlas stepped forward one pace. Not aggressively, just enough to place his body between Caleb and the folder. His gaze moved from Preston's face to the man's right shoe. Caleb noticed it then. Reddish mud dried along the edge of Preston's sole, pressed into the seam near the heel. The service road was gray gravel. The lawn was dark loam. But the mud on Preston's shoe had the same rust-red color as the damp earth in Ruth Mallory's photograph, the earth around the old relief road before it vanished into the trees. Caleb's eyes shifted to the folder. Preston saw the movement, and closed it. You have been around the back acres, Caleb said quietly. This is my family property. Not all of it was always your family property. The words came out before Caleb had decided to speak them. Preston's face changed so quickly that the morning seemed to pause. Only a flicker, gone in a breath, but enough. Atlas gave a low rumble from deep in his chest. Preston glanced toward the carriage house doors, then toward the eastern wall inside. Caleb saw his eyes linger there. Not on the sagging roof. Not on the broken window. On the wall Atlas had guarded through the night. You should be careful with old stories, Preston said. His voice remained smooth, but the warmth had left it. People remember them incorrectly. Pictures remember better, Caleb replied. Preston's gloved hand tightened around the folder. For one long second, either man moved. The mansion watched from behind them with its blank windows. The carriage house stood open ahead, smelling of cedar, leather, and old rain. Then Preston forced a laugh that did not travel far. A few photographs do not make a claim. You will find that property law is less romantic than my aunt's little notes. He slipped the folder under his arm. My offer expires tonight. Caleb looked at Atlas. The dog had turned away from Preston now and was staring into the carriage house, straight at the eastern wall. Then it will expire, Caleb said. Preston's mouth flattened. He stepped closer, only one pace, and Atlas moved instantly, placing himself squarely in front of Caleb. No bark. No show. Just presence. Preston stopped. The old bell above the carriage shifted in the still air and released one small, bright note. The sound made Preston look up sharply. His composure cracked again, this time with something like recognition. Caleb saw it and understood that the bell meant something to him too, or at least to the story he was trying to bury. Without another word, Preston turned and walked back across the wet grass. His SUV reversed too fast, tires grinding softly over gravel, then disappeared behind the mansion. Caleb waited until the engine noise faded. Only then did he move. He entered the carriage house with Atlas beside him and crossed to the eastern wall. The shelves seemed different in daylight, less like clutter and more like cover. He removed the cracked lanterns, the empty tins, the folded horse blankets stiff with age. Behind them, the boards held a clean rectangle, pale against the darker wood, where something had once concealed a seam. Caleb ran his fingers along the wall and found a line nearly invisible beneath dust. Atlas sat at his feet, eyes bright. Caleb took the small brass key from his pocket. It did not fit any visible lock, because the lock was not visible. He pressed along the seam until one narrow board gave slightly. A round keyhole appeared, no larger than a dime, hidden behind a sliding knot in the wood. Caleb inserted the key. It turned with a soft click. The wall released a breath of cold air. A narrow panel opened inward, revealing not a room, but a shallow compartment holding a rolled map wrapped in faded canvas. Caleb lifted it out and unrolled it across the workbench. The paper showed the carriage house, the mansion, the maple grove, and behind them a thin marked line labeled Carriage Road. At its end, beneath the drawing of a great maple tree, Eleanor had written 3 words in blue ink: "Atlas will know." Caleb looked down. Atlas was already at the open door, facing the trees beyond the carriage house, nose lifted to the wind, waiting for him to follow. Atlas crossed the threshold before Caleb had fully folded the map, moving with a certainty that made the old carriage house feel less like a building and more like a starting place. The late morning light had strengthened, turning the wet grass silver and setting tiny beads of water along every bare branch. Caleb tucked the canvas map beneath his coat beside the photographs, then followed the German shepherd around the side of the carriage house where the weeds grew higher and the world became quieter. Behind them, the mansion stood on its hill with clean windows and a cold roofline, but in front of them the land sloped gently into a forgotten section of the estate where no mower had passed in years. Atlas lowered his nose to the ground and walked slowly, not wandering, not hunting, but reading. Caleb had seen him work that way before, years ago in places where men trusted the dog's nose more than their own instruments. Here, there was no danger, only damp leaves, old roots, and a silence so deep it seemed to be waiting for permission to speak. The map showed a curved road behind the carriage house, but Caleb saw only brush and moss and flattened grass. Then Atlas stopped, lifted one front paw, and pressed it against a patch of earth between 2 thorny shrubs. Caleb crouched and brushed aside the leaves. At first, his fingers found mud. Then stone. Flat, smooth, and set too evenly to be natural. He cleared more with both hands, ignoring the cold damp that worked into his sleeves. Another stone appeared, then another, aligned in a gentle curve beneath decades of soil. "There you are," he whispered. The words were not meant for the road alone. They were for Eleanor, for the families in the photographs, for every footstep that had once crossed here and then been forgotten. Atlas moved ahead a few yards and stopped again. Caleb followed, pulling vines aside, uncovering the road piece by piece. Each stone seemed to hold a different weather: rain-darkened edges, pale centers, red clay tucked in the seams. The path led toward the maple grove beyond the service yard, exactly where Eleanor had marked it. As they walked, the carriage house disappeared behind them, hidden by brush, and the sounds of the estate changed. The drip of roof water faded. The mansion grew distant. In its place came the creak-like whisper of wind in tall grass, the soft crackle of leaves under Caleb's boots, and Atlas's steady breathing. The great maple stood at the far end of the path, larger than the others, its trunk wide enough that Caleb could not have reached around it with both arms. Its bark was deeply furrowed, blackened in places by age, and its roots rose from the ground like the backs of old hands. Atlas approached it with care. He did not bark. He circled once, nose close to the earth, then sat beside a stone half-buried near the roots. The stone was shaped differently from the others, rounder, with an iron ring sunk into its center and nearly sealed by rust. Caleb knelt. His heart had begun to beat in the old measured way it did when a structure demanded patience. He tugged the ring. It did not move. He dug around it with a broken branch, then with his fingers, scooping away mud, leaves, and a mat of fine roots. The iron emerged slowly, reddish and wet. Atlas leaned close, watching every movement. Caleb wrapped both hands around the ring and pulled again, using his legs, not his back. For a moment, the earth held on. Then something below released with a low, reluctant groan. The stone lifted just enough for a seam of dark air to appear beneath it. A smell rose from below, cool and dry despite the wet morning, carrying paper, old wood, and the mineral breath of earth that had not seen daylight in many years. Caleb paused, listening. No rush of water. No shifting soil. No sound except Atlas's breath and the distant call of a bird. He lifted the hatch higher and found a set of narrow wooden steps descending into darkness. They were old but not rotted, protected by the slope and the stone cover. Eleanor, he realized, had not merely hidden something. She had preserved it. Caleb returned to the truck for his flashlight, a coil of rope, and a pair of work gloves. He moved with the careful rhythm that had never left his hands, testing each step before trusting it. Atlas waited at the opening until Caleb reached the bottom, then followed, placing his paws lightly on the boards as though he understood they were walking into memory, not danger. The chamber beneath the maple was small, no wider than a storage room, but neatly built. Timber beams supported the low ceiling. Metal shelves lined the walls. Wooden crates sat stacked in rows, their lids marked with dates and faded paint. 1951. 1952. Relief accounts. Land transfers. Family claims. Caleb's flashlight moved slowly over everything, and the beam trembled when it reached a long table at the center of the room. On it lay maps protected under oilcloth, bundles of letters tied with string, a ledger book, and a framed photograph of the carriage house with its doors wide open and a line of people standing outside, waiting not for charity, but for help they had been promised. Atlas walked to the far corner, and sat beside a metal box larger than the others. A small brass plate on its front bore the Whitaker maple leaf. Caleb took out the little key from his pocket, though he had already used it once, and held his breath. It fit. The lock turned easily, as if the box had been waiting for the right hand rather than fighting time. Inside were deeds, notarized statements, town council records, and a letter addressed in Eleanor's handwriting, to the one who came without asking for anything. Caleb opened it with care. My father said land was safest in the hands of men who already had enough, the letter began. But enough is a word greed never understands. After the flood, this road brought families to shelter, food, medicine, and a promise. Later, that promise was buried under paperwork, fences, and silence. I was too young to stop it, then too afraid, then too ashamed. If you are reading this, I chose you because you repaired a step no one paid you to repair, and because your dog listened to what my family refused to hear. Caleb lowered the page, his throat tight in the dim chamber. He looked around at the boxes, the maps, the sleeping evidence of lives redirected by signatures and locked doors. There was no gold here, no glittering treasure to make a poor man suddenly rich. Yet the room felt heavier than any vault. It held names, homes, promises, a town's forgotten debt. Atlas rested his chin on the edge of the metal box and closed his eyes for a moment, as if his work, at least for now, was done. Above them, faint through the open hatch, wind moved in the branches of the great maple. Caleb folded Eleanor's letter and placed it back with the records. He understood now why Preston had come so quickly, why he wanted demolition, why the carriage house had been called useless with such urgency. Useless things did not need to be erased. Only true things did. Caleb stood in the underground room beneath the buried road, one hand on Atlas's head, and felt the quiet weight of a choice settle over him. He could sell, disappear, and let silence keep its old shape. Or he could carry these names back into daylight. Atlas opened his amber eyes and looked toward the stairs. Caleb nodded. You are right, he whispered. They have waited long enough. Caleb brought the first metal box into daylight just after noon, and the world above seemed almost too bright for what had been kept below it. The clouds had broken into long white seams, and sunlight fell through the maple branches in pieces, touching the wet stones of the old road one by one as if counting them back into existence. Atlas climbed out after him, shook damp earth from his coat, then stood beside the open hatch with the solemn patience of a guard who understood that a door once open must not be left unwatched. Caleb carried the records to the carriage house in 3 careful trips. Each box felt heavier than paper should, not because of weight alone, but because every folder inside seemed to hold a family's lost direction, a signature that had bent someone's life, a promise that had waited 70 years to be spoken aloud again. He laid the deeds, ledgers, maps, photographs, and Eleanor's letter across the workbench beneath the small brass bell. The carriage house no longer looked empty. It looked chosen. Dust floated in the sunlight. The covered carriage stood quietly behind him. The eastern wall, open now, breathed a faint coolness from its hidden compartment, and the old bell above swayed once though the air was still. Caleb did not waste time wondering whether it was the building settling. Some questions did not need to be solved to be respected. He called Mr. Hale from the truck, because the signal inside the carriage house came and went like a hesitant thought. The attorney answered on the third ring, and Caleb heard office voices in the background, a printer, a chair moving, the ordinary music of a world where paper still had power. "Mr. Hale," Caleb said, "I found what Mrs. Whittaker wanted found." There was a pause. "What kind of thing?" Caleb looked at the workbench. "The kind that needs witnesses." By 2 o'clock, Mr. Hale arrived in a brown sedan with Ruth Mallory behind him in her small hatchback, carrying a camera bag, archival sleeves, and the expression of a woman who had spent the morning deciding that history had waited long enough. Ruth stepped into the carriage house, saw the photographs beside the maps, and pressed one hand lightly to her chest. "My mother was right," she whispered. "There was a road." Mr. Hale did not speak at first. He put on reading glasses, examined the deeds, the town council records, the relief account ledgers, and the notarized statements Eleanor had kept sealed in oilcloth. The more he read, the quieter he became. Caleb watched the attorney's face change from caution to concern, then from concern to something close to grief. "These are original documents," Mr. Hale said at last. "Some of them should have been filed with the county. Some appear to have been replaced by later versions." Ruth began photographing each page under the workbench light, her hands gentle and exact. Atlas lay near the doors, head lifted whenever gravel shifted outside. Caleb had expected Preston to return. Men like Preston did not walk away from buried things simply because they had been uncovered. He came just before 3. The black SUV stopped hard near the carriage house, and Preston stepped out with 2 other men in dark coats, who looked more uncomfortable than threatening, the kind of men brought along to make a bad idea seem official. Preston's face was pale beneath its careful composure. "This is private property," he said before reaching the doorway. Mr. Hale turned from the workbench. "It is property currently deeded to Mr. Turner according to your aunt's final will." Preston's eyes moved over the open boxes, the maps, the old photographs, the letter in Eleanor's blue ink. Something in him seemed to drain away. "Those materials belong to the Whittaker family." Caleb stood beside the bench, calm in a way that surprised even him. "Some of them belong to the town. Some belong to the families who were promised land after the flood." Preston's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you are looking at." Ruth lifted her camera. "I know what a photograph remembers." The words settled with a strange force. Outside, the clouds shifted again, and sunlight slipped through the cracked round window above the carriage doors, landing directly across the old map labeled Carriage Road. Mr. Hale folded Eleanor's letter carefully and placed it in a clear sleeve. "This will go to the county clerk today," he said. "Copies will go to the Historical Society and the town council. Until there is a formal review, nothing on this section of the estate is to be removed, altered, or destroyed." Preston gave a short laugh, but it had no strength in it. "You think people will care about a flood from 1951? Caleb looked at the names in the ledger. He had read them while waiting: Miller, Dawson, Reed, Alvarez, Brooks, families who had signed for temporary shelter and never received the land allocated to them. He thought of people standing in line outside the carriage house and Ruth's photographs, muddy, tired, still hoping that a promise written on paper could become a roof over their children. "People care when their grandparents were lied to," Caleb said. "They care when a town was taught to forget on purpose." Atlas rose then, not with alarm, but with quiet authority, and walked to Caleb's side. Preston looked at the dog, then at the bell above the carriage. For one brief moment, he seemed less like a powerful man and more like a boy who had inherited a locked room and spent his life pretending there was nothing behind the door. "My aunt should have let this die," he said. Caleb shook his head. "She tried living with silence. It did not give her peace." No one answered. The old carriage house held them all in its cedar-scented stillness, the attorney with his records, Ruth with her photographs, Preston with his unraveling certainty, Caleb with mud on his boots and a key in his pocket, Atlas with amber eyes fixed on the road beyond the trees. Then the brass bell rang once. Clear, soft, undeniable. Preston flinched. Ruth closed her eyes. Mr. Hale looked upward as if law itself had paused to listen. Caleb felt the sound pass through the boards, through the workbench, through the documents that had waited longer than most people live. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It felt like release. By sunset, copies of the records were locked in Mr. Hale's car. Ruth had called the director of the Hartwell Historical Society, and Preston had driven away without another word. The estate behind him looked different now. Not smaller, exactly, but less certain of its own shadow. Caleb stood at the entrance of the carriage house while Atlas sat beside him, both of them facing the uncovered stones of Carriage Road glowing faintly in the low evening light. He did not know what the town council would decide, how long the legal review would take, or how many families would come forward with stories their elders had carried quietly for decades. But he knew the truth was no longer underground. Eleanor had placed it in a carriage, beneath a wheel, behind a wall, under a maple tree, and finally into the hands of a man who had nothing to gain by hiding it. Caleb rested his hand on Atlas's head. For the first time in years, the silence around him did not feel like emptiness. It felt like a promise keeping watch. Winter came early to Hartwell that year, not all at once, but in quiet signs, frost silvering the edges of the old stone road, breath rising from porch lights, maple leaves turning brittle along the service lane behind the Whitaker estate. The legal review took weeks, then months, because truth may rise in a single afternoon, but systems move with the slow caution of locked drawers opening one by one. Mr. Hale filed every document. Ruth Mallory preserved every photograph. The Historical Society traced the names in the ledgers and found grandchildren, great-grandchildren, cousins, and widows who had grown up hearing small fragments of a story no one could fully prove. People came to the carriage house holding family Bibles, flood-stained letters, newspaper clippings, and memories passed down at kitchen tables. They came quietly at first, parking along the gravel drive, stepping over the revealed stones of Carriage Road as if entering a church without walls. Caleb listened more than he spoke. That was his way. He stood beside the workbench in the repaired carriage house, wearing the same worn coat, Atlas resting near his boots, while elderly men pointed to names they had not seen written in official ink for 70 years, and women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths when Ruth showed them photographs of young parents standing in line for blankets, flour, and a promise of land after the Great Flood. Some cried. Some only nodded because grief had grown too old to make much noise. Caleb never told them he understood, but something in his stillness made them feel that he did. The town council meetings filled beyond capacity. The first night, people stood along the walls and in the hallway outside, listening as Mr. Hale explained how relief land had been pledged, transferred, altered, and absorbed into the Whitaker estate through papers that should never have replaced the originals. Preston Whitaker attended the first meeting in a dark suit, sitting in the front row with his hands folded and his face carefully blank. He said little. When called upon, he admitted only that he had inherited records he had not fully understood. Perhaps that was true in the narrowest sense. Perhaps it was not. But Hartwell was not looking for a spectacle. It was looking for repair. By the end of January, the county ordered the disputed acres separated from the private estate and placed into a community trust. Some parcels were assigned to descendants of families named in the original relief records. Other sections became protected public land, including the Maple Grove, the Buried Road, and the carriage house itself. Eleanor's final will, strengthened by the hidden documents, gave Caleb the right to remain as caretaker, not owner in the greedy sense, but steward, the kind of word that made more sense to him than landlord ever would have. He accepted the role with a quiet nod in the courthouse hallway, one hand on Atlas's head, the brass key in his pocket warm from his palm. He did not become rich. The newspapers tried to make him sound like he had found a fortune, but that was not true, not in the way people meant it. What he found was a place that needed hands, and hands were something Caleb still trusted. When spring thaw softened the ground, he began repairing the carriage house properly. Volunteers came on Saturdays. A retired plumber from Bay Street fixed the old pipes. 2 high school carpentry students helped replace damaged siding. Ruth brought coffee in a metal thermos, and took photographs of each stage, saying someone ought to document things being put right for once. Mr. Hale donated shelves for a small records room. Families whose names appeared in the ledgers brought framed copies of photographs, quilts, tools, and small keepsakes to create a memorial corner beneath the brass bell. Caleb worked from sunrise until the light failed, measuring boards, leveling steps, patching the roof, sanding doorframes smooth beneath his palms. He built a ramp along the entrance because Eleanor had once stood on a broken step and taught him, without meaning to, that unsafe thresholds keep people out before they know whether they are welcome. Atlas supervised everything. He lay in sun patches, inspected every visitor, followed Caleb along the exposed stones, and slept each night just inside the open carriage doors as though guarding not property, but belonging. By June, a new sign stood beside the entrance, carved by a local woodworker from Fallen Maple, Whitaker Carriage House, rest for the road-weary. Below it, in smaller letters, was Eleanor's name, the flood year, and the names of the families whose records had been found beneath the grove. The first official night it opened, the building held 12 cots, a small kitchen, a washer and dryer donated by the church, a shelf of canned soup, a coffee pot that never seemed to rest, and a quiet room where veterans could sit without being asked to explain themselves. Caleb stood outside at dusk while warm light glowed through the repaired windows. The carriage, cleaned and polished, remained inside along the back wall, not as decoration, but as witness. The brass bell hung above it, its rim bright now from careful polishing. People came that night, an older man waiting for a housing appointment, a woman traveling north after losing her apartment, 2 veterans who had heard there was coffee and no questions, a teenage boy and his grandfather whose car had broken down on Route 9. Caleb greeted each of them the same way, with few words and steady eyes. "Come in," he said. "You can rest here." Later, when the kitchen quieted and the last cup had been washed, Caleb stepped outside with Atlas. Fireflies blinked over the grass. The old stone road shone faintly in moonlight, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. From the mansion hill, now partly converted into trust offices and storage for historical records, the windows reflected stars instead of secrets. Caleb walked to the great maple and placed one hand against its bark. For years, he had believed home was something other people had, something with framed photographs and mailboxes and names written confidently on forms. He had not known it could begin with a key he did not expect, a dog who refused to ignore the unseen, and an old woman who understood that a forgotten building could still carry grace. Atlas leaned against his leg, solid and warm. From inside the carriage house, the brass bell rang once, soft as breath, though no one had touched it. Caleb turned toward the lighted doorway. Someone inside laughed gently. Someone else poured coffee. The road behind him remained open, stone by stone, leading out of darkness and back toward shelter. Caleb smiled for the first time without bracing against it. He had not been left what was worthless. He had been trusted with what the world had forgotten how to value.